Old entries in the diary of a villager. A new resident has come to our village. A man was walking along the path. His face was hidden by the shadow of a hood, and something larger covered with a cloth hung behind his back. The young man was met by the elder. His facial expression was unattractive. His eyes were angry, as if something terrible had happened in his life. The man did not want the traveler to stay here, but the good-natured village elder accepted the stranger. The man had no choice but to ignore what happened. 3 days have passed since the young man settled in their village. He was so quiet that sometimes the villagers forgot about his existence. A couple of curious residents began to show interest in the stranger. A week has passed, followed by 3 more days since the arrival of the stranger. The man found out what the stranger was doing. He looked at 2 kids waving sticks, practicing their blows. The kids peeked through the fence and told him that the stranger trained with a sword every day. He looked as if he had a whole baggage of history behind him. The villager still didn't care about him. A month has passed. The young man continued to train in his yard. The man didn't see him, but he heard him perfectly. Another month has passed. No changes. A stranger is learning how to use a sword, and the villagers are gossiping about him. Some say that he is preparing to take revenge on someone. Others say that he is a fallen knight or some famous mercenary. There was an uproar, but the villager was sincerely not interested. The man decided that tomorrow he would go and watch his training. The daily activities of the traveler gradually aroused curiosity in the man. Anyone wouldn't be able to stand it here. How fast? How strong? What sword techniques does he hone? It's not for nothing that the stranger became a regular in the neighbors' gossip. The man decided that tomorrow everything would become clearer. The villager approached the gap in the stranger's fence and looked into it with curiosity. He was completely disappointed. To the villagers who knew nothing about the art of swordsmanship, the young man might seem incredible, but the man could not agree with them. While he was engaged in trade, he happened to see a couple of knights, and this boy is far from incredible. He believed that the guy probably had good reasons not to stop, so weighty that they torment the soul and ignite the heart. Based on what he saw, the man could say that the young man had not figured out how to resolve them. Now, having satisfied his curiosity, the villager decided that he could leave. A new family has appeared in the village, a retired mercenary, his son and daughter. The daughter's name was Rayma. She was very beautiful. A smile turned her into a real angel. The man decided that tomorrow he would need to start a conversation with her. Then the man remembered something else that could be written down. That young man was still waving his sword. This is the 3rd year already. An inexplicably strange mood brought the man to pen and paper for the first time in a long time. For 2 years he courted Rayma, and in the end she agreed to become his wife. On days like these, he didn't need more to be happy. Thinking about this, the villager smiled and looked at the calmly sleeping Rayma. However, as strange as it may be, that guy with whom he had absolutely nothing in common keeps appearing in his thoughts. About 5 years have passed. While others live, rejoice, get angry, feel sad and look for their happiness, the boy still indifferently waves his sword. From day to day, how long will his asceticism continue? The man decided that tomorrow he would start watching him every day. 5 years, 1 month, 12 days. A young man trains with a sword. 5 years, 4 months and 15 days. A young man trains with a sword. 6 years, 2 months and 18 days. A young man trains with a sword. 6 years, 9 months and 3 days. A lot of snow fell. The young man is still training with the sword. The man and Rayma had a child, a beautiful daughter named Lona. All the villagers came to congratulate them, and the young man continued training. 7 years, 10 months and 27 days. 15 years have passed. The villager first forgot to check whether the young man was working out. Putting his hand to his forehead, the villager realized that this was a stupid question. A boy's training is as natural as the dawn in the morning and the moon in the sky at night. The man decided that it was time to stop doing useless things. From somewhere far away, a voice comes, gradually becoming clearer. Grandfather, grandfather, grandfather. Having opened his eyes, the already grey-haired villager saw his little grandson. The little boy was waking up his grandfather. Lona, who had matured a lot, asked Yong-seok to leave his grandfather behind. Getting out of bed, the grandfather asked where his daughter and grandson were going, to which I received an invitation to go with them to the market. Grandfather refused. The grandfather went to the window, watching his daughter and grandson leave. Looking at the good weather, he is thinking of taking a walk around the village. Inhaling fresh gusts of wind, Grandfather notices that the weather is just a sight for sore eyes. Entering the busy street, Grandfather was immediately noticed. All the residents respectfully greeted the headman, inviting him to taste the logging cat. Having reached a less busy street, Grandfather thought how fleeting time was. Even the village itself had changed. After which, the headman noticed that there was one thing that had not changed over the years. Grandfather stopped at a rotten, overgrown gate that was very familiar to him. About 37 years have already passed. Looking through that very crack in the fence, Grandfather almost lost consciousness. He immediately took off, threw open the gate, and ran inside. In front of him was a giant, battered sword stuck in the ground, on whose knees stood the same young man. He was holding the hilt of a sword, and his body was covered in deep scars. He sat with his eyes wide and not letting go of his sword. For some time, the elder could not take his eyes off this picture. When the silver light that surrounded the grown-up boy faded, he laid the stranger on the ground and closed his eyes. Standing over the body, the grandfather wished him to be in a good place, after which he closed the stranger's eyes. The young man was in a warm bed and luxurious clothes, and he looked very young. When he woke up, he did not understand what kind of strange dream he had. Pereira Estate. The Pereira Estate is located in the southern part of the Kingdom of Hale. It is a famous trading place that connects several nearby kingdoms. Carriages drove through the gates and lines of citizens passed through. The guard at the city gate told the new guy about the most respected people in the city, the students of Pereira. The guards separately noticed the most outstanding personality of the student. She was an 11-year-old girl who received the title of witch. They explained to the newcomer that sorcerers are incredibly rare and valuable, and this girl herself awakened the powers in herself, even at such a young age. The security guard's story, overflowing with enthusiasm, was interrupted by his colleague. He stated that there was nothing wrong with this, because they had an eldest son, a prince. A commotion began between the guards, trying to figure out what they should tell the new recruits about and what they shouldn't. In a commotion, one of the guards said that the prince was more popular. In fact, he even received the nickname careless aristocrat. The guard then explained that all the boy did all day was sleep. But everyone knows that this is not surprising, because Iron's mother died right before his eyes. Suddenly, an irritated voice interrupted the guards, asking what they were doing here. The guards turned around with displeasure and saw Curlia. She stood in a richly decorated robe with her hands on a cross. It was clear from her face that she was angry, and behind her stood a woman who was the second wife, Amelia Pereira. The little talent scolded the guards, knocking apologies and regrets out of them one after another. This continued until the woman calmed the irritated girl. The girl managed to calm her daughter down, after which the queen and her daughter left, leaving the guards alone, on the condition that this would not happen again. The guards exhaled with calm souls, surprised at how intimidating this little girl was, after which the guards came to the conclusion that they were both strong, so the future of the estate promises to be bright, and that the prince is their absolute opposite. Meanwhile, in his room, Iron jumped up, hitting the bed with his hands, shouting how it infuriated him. Today, for the first time, he cannot sleep. Although he has been sleeping all day long without doing anything, he realized that everything had changed after that strange dream. The salty taste in my mouth from fatigue and the screaming pain in my muscles felt all too real, and more importantly, his body is itching all the time. He can't even stand still. The boy jumped out of bed, calling at least someone here. The butler, who looked into his chambers, responded to his cry. The boy hesitantly stated that he wanted to train. He wants to learn how to wield a sword. The butler was shocked by what he heard. He couldn't believe his ears. The Pereira family's training ground. Many knights conduct their training here. Turning around the passage, the soldiers could not believe their eyes. The same lazy prince entered the platform. Usually even his face is difficult to catch. No one understood why the prince came here, unless he came here to practice fencing. Iron walked up to the weapon stand and stopped at a large, wide sword. Everyone around was surprised by the prince's choice. Seeing the boy's choice, the butler explained to him that each sword has its own characteristic, depending on the size, shape, and length. The butler fussily explained that he did not understand the art of wielding a sword, and if the prince waited, he would bring a good expert in fencing, which Iron confidently refused, after which he grabbed the sword, which was clearly not the right size for him. The butler continued, trying to tactfully explain to the prince that this sword did not suit him. Taking a heavy breath, Iron did the impossible according to the soldiers around him, raising a huge sword with his frail hands. The prince began to wave a huge sword, just like in the dream he had. The stately knights looked at the frail boy, discussing that it was not even surprising that he was so bad. They understood that nothing would work out for a lazy person who spent all day doing nothing but sleeping. The only positive thing the men noted was the prince's surprisingly good flock. The soldiers wondered what kind of cancer whistled, that the prince suddenly stopped messing around and began to practice fencing. One of the knights suggested that the crayfish must be the young Lord Chiron from the neighboring estate. Not understanding what the soldier was getting at, the man asked what he meant. It turned out that quite recently, Lord Chiron openly disgraced the prince. Iron hasn't answered him since then. The soldiers concluded that the young prince had endured it, or that he was incapable of anything at all. When leaving, the knights decided that this fleeting hobby of the prince would last a maximum of 3 days. What he heard hurt the butler. He immediately approached the prince and said that to master the art of the sword, daily grueling training is necessary. The butler understood that it would be very difficult for the boy to cope with this, so he suggested finding him a talented swordsman so that Iron could start training tomorrow. But the prince did not listen to him. He continued to swing his sword. He felt that every time he swung, not only his arms hurt, but all his muscles screamed from tension. But despite all this, for some reason the prince's soul felt so calm. The prince fell, but every time he got up, repeating over and over again what he had dreamed in his dream, he began to feel the heaviness in his chest weakening. Each time he swung, his hated memories and the burden that lay on his shoulders seemed to evaporate. He couldn't stop. The butler wrapped his arms around him, asking him to stop. He shouted that it was already getting dark, but the prince did not even notice the time passing. But suddenly, the prince fell. His strength left him. Looking exhaustedly into the sky, the prince saw the sunset. He became convinced that it was already getting dark. The butler held him back and shouted that Iron was too overzealous today. The prince was sincerely surprised by the fact that his butler had been standing nearby all this time and waiting. The prince whispered to him that he could go on business or call him early. Supporting the prince, the butler said that he could not ask him to go somewhere. Moreover, the prince did not react to his words. Helping the prince walk, the butler said that he would order the place to be cleared out, but it was time for the prince to go and rest, after which he asked Iron not to overdo it anymore. The prince, exhausted, said that he agreed, but he was unlikely to do this again. When Iron changed his clothes and went to bed, he fully felt the pain from the unexpected training. All his muscles hurt, and his bones were breaking. The prince shouted he was probably out of his mind. He didn't understand what kind of dream this was. Grabbing his muscles, he thought that now he would certainly not be able to sleep. But not even 5 minutes had passed before the prince was fast asleep. A couple of days later, the prince was in the dining room, eating and drinking voraciously. Looking at him, the butler still could not get used to this Iron. He asked him if the prince would go and train today. The prince, without being distracted from his sandwiches, mumbled that he would go to train today too. From that day on, an incomprehensible dream continued to haunt him. In order to get rid of the itching in his body, he continued to train. The prince noticed that when he waves his sword, no unnecessary thoughts arise in his head, and he understood that doing something useful was not the worst scenario. The prince screamed and asked to bring him more milk and sandwiches. Iron knew that if he wanted to train, he needed to eat well. Soldiers crowded around the training field. They wanted to see the prince's results in fencing. The soldiers placed bets and discussed the upcoming spectacle until they were interrupted by Grandfather, who came up from behind. Grandfather, dressed in a robe, wondered how he could get to the training ground. He explained to the guards that he was a knight-errant and he wanted to see this estate, and at the same time, look at the site. At the end of their shift, the soldiers escorted my grandfather to the landing ground. The guards were eager to find out who won. Entering the site, they exclaimed in surprise that the prince had come after all. "Prince, I've been training for 4 days now." Of all the soldiers, only one was happy about this, having put the prince in the presence that day. The soldiers decided that apparently the Viscount's son had greatly disgraced the prince. They joked that perhaps the prince's persistence lasted for another week. The grandfather came into the hall and examined the prince. It seemed to him that he was holding up quite well. However, his skill level is no good. Grandfather, continuing to inspect the prince's training, noticed that Iron was so weak that he could barely hold the sword, and he doesn't have enough stamina. He breathes erratically. The old man was curious how long the prince would last. An old man, he had heard rumors that Iron was training because of a grudge against a young lord from a neighboring estate. Making a displeased grimace, the grandfather decided that this was not the way to approach the art of the sword, and because of this, the prince would not last long. Grandfather decided that Iron would soon give up. Suddenly the wind rose on the field. Everyone raised their heads up. The princess flew over the field riding on the legendary griffin. Griffin, a creature from legends that does not exist in reality. The body is like a lion, the wings are like an eagle, the skin is as strong as steel. Kyrilia landed on the griffin right on the training. This shocked everyone. She put her hand to the pet's soft fur. To create an animal with your own hand and then infuse energy into it, making it alive. This is the ability of the sorceress Kyrilia Pereira. Looking angrily, she pointed to the guards and grandfather, asking if they were doing extraneous business at the post. After which, she asked them if it was non-working time. The guards immediately lined up and said uncertainly that they had literally just finished their shift properly. One of the guards explained that there were sentries on duty who were now on shift and they did nothing that caused problem. The princess cried out in displeasure. Did the guard really dare to argue with? After which, she said displeasedly that the guards, instead of training, just stood there and scratched their tongue. The princess was surprised and turned around. Iron called her. He asked her what was the matter. The princess, looking away, could not find words, after which she ordered everyone to stop. Iron asked, confused, what exactly they should stop, after which he received an answer that it was time for them to stop engaging in useless nonsense. The prince immediately turned away and gripped his sword, preparing to continue his training. This greatly infuriated the princess. She shouted in irritation, "Doesn't Iron understand that sword art is not easy?" After which, she noticed that all these years all he did was sleep, and now I suddenly decided to train with the sword a little. Then, she asked irritably, did he really expect this to change anything? The princess continued and continued to shout at Iron, pointing at the new recruit, saying that even this new guy was 100 times better at wielding a sword than the prince. At the end, the princess asked if this was all because of what he was told 2 weeks ago. The queen interrupted the irritated screams of the princess, asking her not to disturb her brother and go to her. Kyrilia clearly didn't like this, but she still fell silent. The queen walked down to the training ground. Wishing the soldiers good service, she approached Iron. The queen noticed that he had perked up. Smiling, she asked the prince not to overdo it. After which, she and the princess left the training field. Grandfather smiled and wondered why she didn't take the bird with her. Pondering what he saw, Grandfather thought, could this really be the same Kyrilia Pereira that there are rumors about? Grandfather noticed that it was like a blast wave that suddenly surged as it passed by. Then the elder noticed that all this confusion did not shake the prince's concentration in the least. As he left, he concluded that he would have to watch Iron for a few more days. Night. The princess sneaked along the corridors of the castle until the butler scared her, saying that the prince was now sleeping. The butler invited her to visit the prince tomorrow, to which she immediately received a refusal with the words that she had business with the prince, and it could not wait until he woke up. Pressing a threatening aura on the butler, she warned that the butler had better not tell anyone about what had happened. The butler fell to his knees and realized that it was better to let the princess go. The next morning, Iron woke up to a beautiful melody played on a pipe by a cat dressed in a tailcoat. Near the cat, there was a letter in which the princess apologized for not saying this in the morning. When the princess learned that the prince was not eating properly and was overworking himself, she became very worried. Therefore, she gives him a musical doll that will help him relax. In the end, she asked not to tell her mother about this because she asked not to bother him. I turned the letter over and Iron saw that there was a message on the reverse side. In it, the queen asked in small print to tell her if Kyrilia bothered him, and until that moment she would pretend that she didn't know anything. After reading the letter, Iron, stroking the kitten, was glad that his mother and sister were taking care of him, but he lay in bed like a non-entity for more than 10 years. While going to breakfast, Iron wondered if he would eat with his family today. The butler, who informed him about breakfast, was incredibly glad the prince had changed. At breakfast, the sister, without stopping, shifted food to the prince. Unexpectedly, the prince said that he thanks his mother, father, and Kyrilia. He always wanted to thank them. They are so kind to him, even though he has done nothing but lie in bed. Previously, he was even ashamed to say this. Iron asked for forgiveness and said that he loved them all. Everyone was glad to hear this from the prince. The father then said that he heard that his son had been focusing his attention on fencing lately. The father praised his son, saying that training the body is a commendable thing, although a little belated. Having finished, his father asked him not to overdo it. Iron reassured his father, saying that he would not overdo it, and he understood that his training, compared to those in the dream, was just a trifle. The noble knights came to the training field again, wondering what day the prince had been training. One of them said about half a month. They thought it was beyond their comprehension. The prince trains for so long and never misses a day. They asked if the prince had finally got his brains back into place. Some believed the prince would soon reach his limit, while others, on the contrary, did not think so. One of the soldiers noticed that he had been seeing an old man sitting here in the corner for a long time. It was the 10th day of his observation of the prince's training. At first, he reasoned that the prince's motivation for learning the art of the sword was only an inferiority complex and pride. That is why he thought that the prince would not be enough for a long time. However, in reality, his judgments were wrong. Sloppy aristocrat. He heard that this nickname was given to him because of how lazy he was. As someone who has never exercised in his life, the prince continues to train tirelessly without a single dislike on his face. He goes about his day with the mindset of a blacksmith forging iron, without hesitation, as if he has been living at this pace for decades. After looking through his entire life, the old man could not remember anyone with such a will. No matter how great a hero is, such an iron will accumulate only at a fairly mature age, and before the old man's eyes, there is only a boy of 15 years old. If the prince continues to train in fencing and fulfills his potential as an apprentice to a good teacher, what heights can he reach? Iron continued to train, and his grandfather continued to watch him. Grandfather asked the guard standing nearby if the prince, who was training on the site, had a personal teacher. The man replied that the owner of the estate had just recently said that he would soon assign a fencing master to the prince. The man noticed that Iron was trying so hard, it would be a pity to place him without proper control. The man suggested that Orn Xiukran would most likely become Iron's teacher. The girl suddenly exclaimed that this couldn't be done. Such a precious child should never be trusted with a libertine who, the day before regular training, drinks buckets of alcohol, and then yells at the soldiers. Grandfather jumped up and headed somewhere, thinking that he needed to hurry up. The boy has talent. We can't let him sink into oblivion. Grandfather decided that he should meet with the owner of the estate. Iron's father couldn't believe his ears. Did his son really have great potential? Chrono Fencing Academy, the best academy on the entire continent, which selects only talented people, regardless of gender, nationality, and status. It is enough to become her official student, to be treated with much more respect than an aristocrat. This place is famous for its reputation, which is higher than that of the Royal Academy. However, the greatness of Chrono is commensurate with the level of difficulty of entering it, and getting out of there is just like a 1-2 punch. Father didn't know if Iron could withstand the endless competition there. The father called his son to him and told him that he would not insist, but if the son wanted, let him say so. He only tells him about one of the paths, the choice of which is up to Iron. The prince asked his father for a few days to think about it. Iron didn't know if he would succeed. He just lay in bed for 10 years. However, he no longer wanted to continue to stagnate in one place. For his own sake, and for the sake of his family who loves him very much, Iron went to his father and confidently announced that he was going to the academy. The leaving boy was seen off by his family. Kirlia wished him good luck, and after some time, Iron was riding in a carriage with his butler. The butler asked happily, "This is the boy's first time traveling outside the estate, right?" The prince confirmed. After which, the butler handed the boy a necklace in the form of a sword, which Kirlia asked him to give to him. He happily accepted the gift and immediately put on the necklace. And now, they were already there. The butler said he would escort the boy to the entrance, but Iron unexpectedly refused. He decided that from now on he was a student and he needed to get used to acting alone. Hearing this, the butler cried with happiness, after which he wished the boy to achieve brilliant results. At the entrance, 2 well-equipped knights accompanying the young guy announced that this gentleman was Prince Brad Lloyd from the Earl Lloyd family of the Kingdom of Cobra. He received a recommendation from a knight of high reputation named Cole Shady. The guard greeting the guests happily stated that it was an honor for them to meet such a gifted descendant of the Lloyd family. Then he invited them inside. Iron hesitantly held out the papers and began introducing himself. His name is Iron Pereira. He comes from the baronial Pereira family. A letter of recommendation was given to him by the knight-errant Bran Somerville. The guard shouted joyfully, "The young master of the Pereira family. It is a great honor for them to meet him." After which the guard said that they also knew the knight Bran Somerville. This great gentleman led a raid in the mines for several decades, since the prince was recommended by such such an outstanding person. His successful passing of the exams will be the expected result. After which the guard let Iron inside and wished him good luck. When Iron left, the guards began to whisper to each other. They were surprised that old man Bran Somerville wrote a letter of recommendation, after which the second guard recognized the prince as that same careless aristocrat. The guard didn't understand what kind of careless aristocrat he was talking about, to which the second guard said, "It's surprising that he doesn't know the lazy Pereira family." After which he noticed that judging by the prince's physique, this was clearly the same lazy person. Peering at Iron, they did not understand why he could appeal to that picky old man. Entering the audience, the prince was greeted by dozens of gazes. Everyone stared at him with incredible contempt. Iron told himself that he needed to maintain composure. Suddenly the prince saw a familiar face of a man entering the stage. A man came up on stage and announced that he was welcoming the 400 students who had passed the pre-selection. He introduced himself. His name was Ahmed. From today on, he will train and evaluate everyone who comes. Ahmed, having examined those who had come, noticed that today there were several very interesting personalities. Of course, the second genius of the Linga family of swordsmen, Ilya Linga, stood out most of all. They say she is much more talented than her older brother. The guy who passed in front of the prince noticed Ilya and angrily wondered why she came here. He assumed that because of her, he would not have a chance to take first position in the ranking. Suddenly, Ahmed announced that everyone present here was not yet students, but only pre-selection students. After which she said that she thinks everyone knows how hard the training is here. If they pass 2 tough tests, and a year later are also able to attend this place, then they will become real students. However, after officially entering Chrono Academy, even greater hell awaits them. After the speech, the knight asked everyone to leave their things here and leave. Having brought the children to the spacious stadium, Ahmed took off his heavy armor and began to tell them that physical training would take place here, in which they would develop the endurance of the heart, lungs and muscle. Suddenly jumping up, the coach shouted that the endurance test had begun. He ordered everyone to run after him. The children, who did not expect such a turn, immediately rushed after the coach. Ahmed, looking back at the running kids, shouted that everything was somehow boring and we needed to increase the speed a little. Shouting that he congratulated them and that he had underestimated them, he decided to add even more speed. The blue-haired guy tried to keep up with the coach. He understood that the race was going to be long and he had to keep the rhythm. He decided to run behind and monitor the situation from there. The guy looked back at Iron, who was already sitting exhausted, and asked him, where was their careless aristocrat? Iron felt like his heart was about to explode. It flashed through his head that this was too hard. He would no longer be able to run. He saw the coach's gaze and how the children were moving further away from him. He couldn't take a single step. However, the prince rushed, declaring to himself that he would get up. After all, this is nothing compared to what the man went through in his dream. He repeated to himself that she wants to be like him. He wants to be equal to him, and for this, he must escape from his lazy self. The coach saw the prince running again and smiled. The second guard, who was at the entrance with the trainer, was surprised that Iron continued to run. He thought the prince would immediately surrender. Having looked closely, he thought that something was clearly wrong with the boy. He saw not a young lazy man, but something else. Unexpectedly, the guard saw that the coach and the people running behind him were quickly catching up with Iron. Realizing that the boy was about to be carried away, he jumped up with lightning speed and took the boy out of the way. Looking at the recently fallen boy, the guard noticed that the prince fell not from simple overwork, but from complete exhaustion. He squeezed out all the strength he could muster. Iron woke up on a bed in an unknown room. A man called out to the prince and asked him not to worry about his health. His name was Lun Tahal. He is an instructor and also the head of the rehabilitation department. Lung proudly stated that if it were not for him, the prince would not have recovered so quickly. After which, smiling, he noted that most likely they would see each other often. Iron thanked Luna, after which he received a scroll with the students' ratings based on the results of the first test. Lung asked not to worry too much because the intermediate assessment, unlike the final assessment, does not greatly affect the official admission to the academy. The first test was needed only to approximately determine the level of endurance of the pre-recruitment students. Iron, looking for his name in the lists, saw himself in the very last 400th place. Lun noticed that the higher the place, the happier the soul. However, the lower, the greater the incentive to try harder, isn't it? He continued the story. This rating a year later will change beyond recognition. There is no point in being sad. He wanted to cheer Iron up, but looking at his face, he didn't see a drop of despair. The prince accepted the test results absolutely calmly. Seeing such a reaction, Lung thought that the boy did not look like someone who needed it. The rumors about the prince's eccentricity were not true. A second later, Lung was already kicking Iron out of the room, telling him that he shouldn't miss the first training session. The teacher was already speaking in the audience. He welcomed the pre-selection students, after which the teacher introduced himself. His name was Karaka. He is one of the instructors who is responsible for the training. From now on, their day will follow a certain schedule: breakfast, training, lunch, training, dinner, mental training, and general education lesson. After 7 in the evening free time. From this day on, they have access to all outdoor areas, the indoor gym, and other training areas available at the academy. Anyone can use them in their free time as self-study. Hearing this, Iron was happy. Finally, today he will be able to take the sword in his hand. The teacher suddenly raised his finger up and declared that training with weapons was prohibited. This wounded the prince to the very heart. Evening. 2 guys asked Lloyd if he found regular lessons boring. He almost fell asleep listening to the theory. One of the guys laughed and said that it was because they said a bunch of words, the meaning of which the guy didn't know. To which he irritably replied that he now understood him perfectly well, and it would be better for him to shut up. A group of guys entered the training room. There were many pumped-up students doing dumbbell, doing push-ups and jumping rope. The guys noticed that from the first day, everyone was plowing. Lloyd turned his attention to the end of the hall. There was a girl with white hair lifting a barbell with an incredible load. It was Elijah Linjay. Rumors about her were, on the contrary, an understatement. As soon as you look at her, you immediately feel the pressure. Lloyd felt that the other students were no match for her. Standing next to each other, he began to feel inferior. They were on completely different levels. Everyone around was in shock. They did not understand where she got such a physique. Looking into another part of the hall, they saw a careless aristocrat engaged in self-discipline. They joked about why he suddenly jumped up to do this. He should have started doing this a long time ago. Why did he sit idle for so many years? Watching Iron lift the barbell without weights, they mocked that he was about to faint. Lloyd called out to his gang and urged them to stop wasting their time. As he walked away, he saw another pumped-up girl. The girl with red hair was an ordinary commoner named Judith. She displaced him from second position in the ranking. It looks like she had to work hard to get into the academy. Looking angrily at her from the side, Lloyd thought that he would no longer allow someone like her to steal his place. The girl suddenly turned around and screamed angrily for Lloyd to stop staring at her. He didn't believe it was her who told him, to which she angrily asked, who was she looking at now? She stated that Lloyd was making it difficult for her to concentrate. His gang immediately appeared in front of Lloyd, angrily asking what she was saying there, and that she apparently didn't understand who was in front of her. They unanimously declared that she, a non-entity, was not allowed to behave rudely. Without being taken aback, she immediately asked if you were his girlfriend's regulars. The guys ordered her to get on her knees and start praying for forgiveness. Suddenly, everyone fell silent and looked in one direction. At the end of the hall, Ilya approached Iron and asked if he could listen to her. It was so unexpected that everyone in the room was shocked. No one heard what the prince was talking about. Having finished the dialogue, Ilya calmly left the sala. Iron noticed that there was silence in the hall. He turned and saw how all the people in the hall turned away sharply, pretending that they had not looked in his direction. Lloyd and Judith remarked together that they hadn't heard anything. Judith suddenly stood up and walked towards Iron without saying a word. Judith approached and called out to the prince. She asked irritably why he was ignoring her. Iron removed the bar and apologized. The irritated girl asked him to lay it all out. The prince did not understand what she was talking about. She approached and said, Elijah Linjay, what were they talking about?